When I first bought the corner house on Maple Crest Drive, the place looked like any other suburban dream. Perfect lawns, freshly painted shutters, and an HOA that promised order, beauty, and harmony. It felt like a safe investment, especially for someone like me. Someone who worked from home, enjoyed quiet evenings, and appreciated stability. But stability alone doesn't pay the mortgage, and the house came with more space than I needed. Turning the guest suite above the garage into a short-term rental felt like the perfect solution. It wasn't intrusive. It wasn't rowdy. It wasn't disruptive. It was simply smart. At first, the guests trickled in. Weekend travelers. Remote workers passing through. A couple who wanted to stay somewhere cozier than a hotel while visiting their daughter in college. They kept to themselves, parked in the driveway, and followed the check-in instructions meticulously. I cleaned, maintained, and prepared the suite with the kind of care most people reserve for their own bedrooms. Everything seemed perfectly normal until the HOA's peace was disturbed by something far more powerful than noise. Change. Every HOA has that one resident who treats the bylaws like sacred scripture and patrols the neighborhood like a self-appointed guardian of order. Ours was no exception. She saw cars she didn't recognize, suitcases she didn't expect, and smiling faces she felt didn't belong. And to her, it wasn't curiosity, it was chaos. The HOA meeting that followed was a spectacle of suspicion and exaggerated grievances. There were claims of strangers wandering the area, accusations of increased traffic, and warnings about property value decline, none of which had any proof behind them. It didn't matter. The board latched onto the idea that short-term rentals posed a dire threat to the neighborhood's tranquility. Their decision arrived in my mailbox less than a week later. A formal notice stating that short-term rentals were prohibited within the community. No discussion, no hearing, no attempt at compromise. Just a printed page with neat bullet points outlining everything I was no longer allowed to do. It was presented under the guise of neighborhood protection, though there was never any actual issue. No late-night parties. No damage. No disturbance. Just a quiet, steady stream of respectful visitors. Still, the HOA insisted their decision was final. Sitting at my kitchen counter, staring at that letter, something inside me shifted. I had bought my home fair and square. I paid my dues. I followed every rule that mattered. But I wasn't about to let the HOA dictate how I used my own property when their reasoning was rooted in paranoia rather than evidence. The letter didn't feel like a rule. It felt like a challenge. And I wasn't one to back down. I began by dissecting the bylaws, not casually but obsessively, the way someone studies an opponent before a match. The document was long-winded, filled with contradictions, vaguely defined terms, and regulations that probably made sense decades ago but didn't age well. Most of it dealt with paint colors, landscaping rules, fence heights, and approved mailbox designs. Somewhere buried in the middle, there was a section about the residential nature of the community. The HOA was leaning on that clause to justify banning short-term rentals, arguing that anything transient violated the spirit of residential living. But as I read deeper, something peculiar stood out. The HOA prohibited rentals shorter than 90 days, but the restrictions applied only to residential leasing activity. Nowhere in the document did it say anything about events, gatherings, or community use. In fact, the bylaws specifically allowed homeowners to host community-oriented activities, provided they didn't impede traffic or disturb the peace. The language was shockingly open-ended. It didn't specify what qualified as a community activity. It didn't limit the frequency. It didn't restrict attendance. It didn't even require HOA approval except for activities that used shared spaces. An idea emerged, subtle at first, then bolder, sharper, and far more mischievous than anything I'd considered before. If the HOA didn't want me renting my guest suite to travelers, then perhaps I wasn't renting it anymore. Perhaps I was offering something else. Something the bylaws had unintentionally left wide open. I spent the next 2 days researching legal definitions, zoning codes, and municipal regulations. I mapped out every risk, every loophole, every potential violation. To my surprise, the city was surprisingly relaxed. As long as I wasn't operating a commercial venue or charging admission at the door, hosting small-scale events on my private property was perfectly legal. It was only the HOA that could complicate things, but their own rulebook was full of holes. The plan wasn't perfect yet, but the foundation was there. The suite would no longer be a short-term rental. It would be a community event space, open for workshops, micro-gatherings, retreats, and personal development sessions. People would still book it. They would still come and go. They would still pay. But the arrangement wouldn't be classified as a rental. It would be a service, a gathering, community-centered experience, something the HOA couldn't directly regulate. The more I thought about it, the more deliciously ironic it felt. The HOA wanted fewer visitors, less activity, less novelty. What they were about to get was the opposite. Not chaos, nothing malicious, but a steady, unstoppable flow of perfectly legal guests whose presence they would have no authority over. Before implementing anything, I took the time to prepare. I repainted the suite and added a wall-mounted board explaining the concept of the space. I decorated it with minimalist, soothing decor, flexible enough for meditation sessions, small business workshops, crafting circles, coaching appointments, and photo shoots. I created an online listing framed not as a place to stay, but as a studio available for individual or small group community sessions. The rules were crystal clear, the language carefully designed, the purpose strictly compliant. When the first booking request arrived, it felt like validation, proof that I hadn't wasted my time. It was from a woman who wanted to host a 2-hour mindfulness workshop for herself and 2 friends. Technically, it was an event. Technically, it was community-oriented. Technically, it was allowed. I accepted the request with a quiet satisfaction. The HOA had shut down my Airbnb, so I had built something new. Something they couldn't shut down without rewriting their entire rulebook. And they had no idea what was coming. A few days later, as the first set of guests arrived and walked up the driveway with yoga mats under their arms, I watched from my window. The neighborhood was peaceful, calm, ordinary. But the first ripple had been cast across the still water. It wouldn't stay still for long. Before the HOA realized what I had done, the steady hum of activity would begin. Cars arriving for short gatherings. Visitors leaving after focus sessions. A rotation of guests that never quite stopped. All within the rules. All within my rights. All carefully documented. As the first session ended and the guests left with content smiles, I felt it, the shift. The certainty that the HOA would notice soon enough, and that their reaction would be loud, dramatic, and predictable. But I was ready, because this time, every move I made was backed by the very bylaws they claimed to uphold. And the next chapter of this conflict was about to begin. The first week of community event space activity passed quietly enough. Guests came and went in modest numbers, their visits short and purposeful, their presence subtle. The suite functioned exactly as intended, a legal, compliant, HOA-proof alternative to short-term renting. For a brief moment, I believed the transition might go unnoticed. But peace, much like silence, rarely lasts long in an HOA-governed neighborhood. It began with a shift in atmosphere, the kind of subtle tension that appears before a storm. Neighbors who once walked their dogs with easy friendliness now paused a little longer whenever cars unfamiliar to them pulled into my driveway. Some watched from their porches, arms crossed, faces neutral but alert. Others slowed their pace, pretending to fix a shoelace or check a phone, all while tracking the flow of people entering and exiting the suite. Suspicion grew quietly, creeping through the neighborhood like an unspoken rumor. But it wasn't until the third weekend that the HOA truly became aware of what was happening. One morning, about a dozen cars arrived over the course of 2 hours. The guests were there for a photography session, a small workshop held by a traveling artist who used the suite's natural light as her creative backdrop. She rotated groups in waves, each staying no more than 30 minutes before making room for the next. It was perfectly organized, completely peaceful, and entirely within the rules. But the parade of unfamiliar faces sent ripples of panic through those who believed the neighborhood was being overrun by outsiders. By evening, the first HOA email alert appeared in every resident's inbox. It warned the community of renewed suspicious activity, centered around a particular property. Though the message didn't include my address, everyone knew exactly which house it referred to. The residents who had watched the slow trickle of visitors now felt justified in their vigilance. Still, the warning didn't bother me. If anything, it confirmed that the HOA had finally noticed, but not yet understood, what I was doing. What did trouble me slightly, however, was what happened the next morning. As I stepped outside to fetch the mail, a familiar figure was already walking up the sidewalk. The same self-appointed neighborhood guardian, the one who had initiated the anti-Airbnb crusade, approached with stiff posture and barely contained determination. She didn't speak, of course. She didn't need to. Her presence alone conveyed everything. Disapproval, frustration, suspicion bordering on simmering annoyance. She eyed the driveway, scanned the guest suite entrance, and then turned away abruptly, retreating without a word. It wasn't confrontation yet, not full-blown, but it was a warning shot. A silent message that she knew something was happening, and she intended to escalate it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled just 3 days later. I had planned to attend quietly, merely to observe their reaction, but circumstances made my presence unavoidable. Before the meeting even opened, the board had already compiled a list of property concerns. Most of them directed at me. They had tracked visitor activity, estimated traffic patterns, and attempted to classify the gatherings as rental behavior in disguise. But what struck me most was how little they truly understood. They phrased their accusations with the assumption that I was still operating a short-term rental, unable to conceive of any alternative explanation. The board presented their findings with a sense of triumph, but the moment they mentioned the word rental, everything changed. Their tone, once firm and confident, began to falter when they realized how thoroughly I had followed the rules. They referenced bylaws that no longer applied. They quoted regulations written to prevent leases, not gatherings. And while their frustration grew louder in tone, their authority weakened with every attempt to reinterpret their own documents. For the first time since the ban, the power dynamic shifted. The HOA wasn't in control. They were reacting, scrambling, searching for leverage they no longer had. After the meeting, I returned home with a renewed sense of clarity. The conflict was no longer about misunderstanding or miscommunication. It was about control they felt slipping through their fingers. If they couldn't stop my Airbnb outright, they would attempt to redefine their rules, restructure their authority, or pressure neighbors into reinforcing their narrative. And if that didn't work, they would default to their usual tactic: intimidation. Sure enough, 2 days later, an official HOA compliance notice appeared on my doorstep. It accused me of operating a commercial enterprise on residential property. It claimed that guest turnover violated the spirit of community living. It even attempted to argue that frequent visitors constituted a nuisance, a desperate stretch of logic designed to regain ground. But the notice wasn't legally binding. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't even an official violation. It was nothing more than a strongly worded letter, a paper shield wielded by people who were quickly losing their grip on the situation that I responded with thorough and unwavering precision. I referenced municipal zoning definitions. I quoted the HOA's own bylaws word for word. I cited every clause that protected community activities and every line that restricted only rental or leasing practices, neither of which applied to what I was doing. My reply wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It was factual. And facts, when delivered with complete confidence, carry more weight than any bluster the HOA could muster. The board fell silent for an entire week. No notices, no warnings, no unexpected visits from board members pretending to patrol the neighborhood. Their silence wasn't surrender, it was plotting, a recalibration of strategy. A delay used to discuss new angles, rewrite old rules, or rally more residents to their side. But what they didn't understand was that the community event space was only beginning to grow. Word of mouth spread quickly. Clients reposted their experiences. Local instructors recommended the space. Small businesses started booking sessions for training and creative work. The stream of activity became steadier, more consistent, and far more noticeable. Cars parked neatly along the curb. Visitors arrived with props, notebooks, instruments, art supplies, and presentation boards. Every single visit followed the rules, adhered to community guidelines, and respected the neighborhood's peaceful atmosphere. But to the HOA, none of that mattered. All they saw was movement, visitors, activity, change. Within days, the board's patience snapped. I noticed it first in the uptick of cars slowing as they passed my home, residents glancing toward the suite with thinly disguised annoyance. Then came the sudden shift in neighborhood gossip, the whispers, the sideways looks, the conversations that ceased the moment I approached. And then, the inevitable happened. I received an email summoning me to a special hearing to address what they now termed an escalating disruption to community standards. This time, the board wasn't just annoyed. They were preparing for battle, and they hadn't realized yet that I was several steps ahead. The summons to the special hearing arrived with an air of manufactured urgency, the message stamped with formal language clearly intended to intimidate. It framed my community event space as a threat to neighborhood peace, warning of potential disciplinary action if I failed to attend. But beneath the stern tone, there was something else: desperation. A sense that the board was running out of options. They couldn't find me, they couldn't classify what I was doing as leasing, and they couldn't justify their escalating frustration without stretching their own rules beyond recognition. Still, I prepared thoroughly. I gathered documents, zoning codes, correspondence, bylaws, and timestamps. I organized everything into a clean folder and rehearsed what I needed to present. Not because I feared their tactics, but because I wanted the record to show, beyond any doubt, that every step I'd taken had been lawful, measured, and transparent. If the HOA intended to escalate the situation, they would meet resistance grounded not in emotion, but in clarity. On the day of the hearing, the community clubhouse buzzed with tension. A larger-than-usual audience filled the folding chairs. Neighbors curious to witness the clash, others drawn by rumor, and a few who simply craved the spectacle. The board members sat in a rigid row, their expressions practiced, their posture straightened by a sense of authority they hoped would shield them. But authority means little when the foundation beneath it is cracking. The hearing opened with a recital of grievances. They spoke of increased foot traffic, frequent vehicle presence, and potential safety concerns, each complaint phrased as though it were objective truth. They treated every guest as an intruder and every booking as proof of some insidious agenda. Yet as they listed their concerns, their arguments revealed the same flaw. Nothing they described violated the bylaws as written. They attempted to reframe the gatherings as commercial operations. They tried to invoke noise ordinances, though there had been no complaints filed. They even suggested that the influx of visitors posed a threat to the neighborhood's sense of community, an argument so subjective it carried no enforceable weight. For every accusation they raised, there was a counterpoint anchored directly in their own governing documents. As the board's frustration grew more apparent, the audience's reactions shifted. A few neighbors nodded in solidarity with the HOA, but many exchanged uncertain glances. The more the board stretched to find violations where there were none, the more obvious their overreach became. By the time they finished, the momentum they'd expected to wield had already faltered. When my turn arrived, I addressed every concern systematically and without aggression. I presented the zoning definitions that distinguished short-term rental from event use. I cited the HOA's explicit allowances for community-oriented gatherings. I showed records demonstrating that each event had fewer attendees than the average backyard barbecue. I highlighted how no parking rules had been violated, no disturbances recorded, no damages caused. The room grew still as I continued, not because my tone was forceful, but because the facts left little room for rebuttal. The bylaw language was clear. My actions were compliant. The board's claims hinged on interpretations that their own documents couldn't support. But the most revealing moment came when I explained what would happen if the HOA attempted to revise its bylaws to prohibit event gatherings. Any such amendment would require a community-wide vote, not a board decision, and would need a significant majority to pass. If they proceeded, they would be initiating a battle not with me alone, but with the entire neighborhood. And many residents hosted their own gatherings, parties, club meetings, and small events. A sweeping rule change would affect everyone, not just me. The realization landed heavily. The board's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but the subtle changes, tightened jaws, narrowed eyes, a sudden stiffness, revealed that they understood the corner they'd backed themselves into. They adjourned the hearing with vague promises to review the matter further. There were no fines, no penalties, no official violations, just a thinly veiled attempt to retreat and regroup. As the audience dispersed, whispers filled the room. Some residents approached me quietly, expressing support or curiosity. Others avoided eye contact entirely. But the important part was this: the HOA had failed to shut down the space. The hearing, intended as a show of force, had done nothing but expose their inability to enforce a rule that didn't exist. Yet I knew the conflict wasn't over. The following week, the board's behavior changed. They became more visible, patrolling the neighborhood more often, scrutinizing homes, logging every small infraction they could find. It felt less like governance and more like a search for leverage. But in their efforts to police the community with renewed vigor, they made a critical mistake. They overstepped with residents who weren't involved in the dispute. People who had once supported the HOA's strictness now grew irritated with the sudden, invasive enforcement. Minor landscaping discrepancies were flagged. Trash cans placed 5 minutes early were recorded. Decorative lights were questioned. The board's attempt to regain control backfired spectacularly. Within 2 weeks, the neighborhood's patience reached a breaking point. Complaints flooded the community forums. Neighbors voiced frustration at the board's intrusive behavior. Some demanded an emergency election to restructure the leadership entirely. Others shared their own grievances with HOA Overreach, stories they had been too intimidated to voice before. The conflict that began with my Airbnb had grown into something much larger. A reckoning. By the end of the month, a petition circulated calling for new board elections. The signatures accumulated faster than anyone expected. What had once been a solid, unquestioned authority now stood on unstable ground. The election that followed was swift, decisive, and unmistakable in its message. The community wanted a change. Several board members, including the very resident who had led the anti-Airbnb crusade, were voted out. In their place came individuals more open-minded, more reasonable, more focused on actual issues rather than imagined threats. The new board reviewed my event space, asked genuine questions, understood the legality, and ultimately concluded what had been true from the beginning. It was entirely compliant. With the conflict finally resolved, the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm. Guests continued to visit, peacefully, respectfully, purposefully. The event space flourished. What began as a workaround became something far more meaningful. A small hub of creativity, learning, and connection. And the irony remained ever present. The HOA, in its attempt to shut down my Airbnb, had created a chain reaction that ultimately led to its own restructuring. Their resistance hadn't prevented change. It had caused IT. In the end, I stood on my porch one evening, watching a small group of guests arrive for a weekend workshop. The sun setting behind them, the neighborhood calm and unmarred by conflict. What once felt like a battleground now felt like home again. The rulebook hadn't beaten me, that I had simply learned to read it better than they had.